Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The Arizona Territory in the late 1870s was a place where silence carried further than words. A small cabin stood at the edge of dry land, half hidden by cottonwoods, with its rough-hewn door marked by years of sun and wind. Inside lived Elias Carter, a weathered cowboy past 40, his frame lean, his face worn by trail dust and quiet regret. Once he had worked cattle drives and fought in skirmishes no one spoke about anymore, but now his days narrowed into simple survival. Patching fences, tending a horse too old for range work, cooking beans in a blackened pot. He lived apart from town, apart from people, not because he hated them, but because the weight of his past had taught him that distance was safer for him and for others. On that evening, after a day spent clearing a section of downed rail, Elias returned to his cabin with a mind as tired as his body. He was ready for nothing more than water from the bucket and a plate of cold bread. But when he reached the door, his hand froze on a latch. A figure leaned against the frame. A woman. She was Apache, her dress torn, dust ground into every seam, her face carrying bruises too fresh to hide. Her eyes darted between him and the tree lean, tense, mistrustful, as if ready to bolt, even while her legs trembled with exhaustion. She looked like she had run farther than her body was built to carry, and she was holding on by will alone. Elias felt his jaw tighten, a knot forming in his chest. He knew what it meant for an Apache woman to arrive alone, at night, bruised and desperate. Trouble had already touched her, and trouble would follow. He had a choice. He could turn her away and keep his life simple, the way he had fought to keep it. But as he looked at her, her cracked lips, the faint tremor in her hands, the guarded defiance in her eyes, he knew she wouldn't survive the night out there. And despite everything he had lost, despite his vow to keep to himself, Elias couldn't bring himself to close the door on someone barely holding on to life. He stepped aside without speaking, pushing the door wider. His decision came wordlessly, a quiet acceptance of risk. He knew it could cost him. Still, he gave her the space to walk inside. Her name, though he didn't know it yet, was Ayanna. She had been born in a small Apache band south of the Gila River, but captivity and harsh winters had stripped her life bare. For months, she had been moved from one place to another, labor traded for scraps, promises of safety broken again and again. When she finally escaped, she carried nothing with her except the will to keep walking. By the time she reached Elias's cabin, she was out of options. She hesitated at the doorway, her chest rising with sharp breaths. She studied him as carefully as he had studied her, searching his face for cruelty or deceit. All she found was a man who stood still, waiting. When he offered her his coat, faded wool with patched sleeves, her eyes narrowed. She didn't trust it, didn't trust him. But the cold on her skin won the argument, and she pulled it tight around her shoulders without a word. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and iron. A small fire still burned in the stove, throwing enough heat to fight back the night chill. Elias hung his rifle on the wall, deliberately slow, so she could see it was no longer in his hands. He didn't approach her, didn't try to ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he filled a tin pot with water, set it on the stove, and placed a clean rag on the table within her reach. His way of saying, "You can tend your wounds yourself, and I won't interfere." She remained standing for a long while, her back near the hearth. Her breathing stayed uneven, like each inhale was a decision. Elias let her decide when to move. Finally, she glanced at him, waiting for permission to sit. He gave a small nod toward the chair. Only then did she lower herself into it, the coat drawn close, her eyes still sharp on him, as if testing every movement he made. For Elias, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. He had lived with silence for years. It was his only company. But now it was different. He was aware of every sound. The crackle of the fire, the creak of the chair as she shifted, the faint rasp of her breath. His thoughts turned over and over. Who had hurt her? Would they come looking? Was he prepared to defend her? He knew the answer before the questions even finished forming. If anyone came, he would stand between her and them. He wasn't sure why yet. Maybe because no one had stood between him and loss when it mattered. That night, neither of them spoke much. He poured her water, softened bread and broth, and pushed the bowl across the table. She accepted, though her hand shook. Where her eyes closed briefly, he realized it wasn't only hunger that weakened her. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had carried fear too long. When sleep came, it came uneven. Elias lay on the bed near the wall, facing the door with the rifle under the frame. Ayanna remained in the chair by the fire, boots still on, her hand resting close to the armrest, as if ready to spring awake. Both of them kept their distance. Both of them rested with caution. But for the first time in many nights, neither was alone. The fire burned low in the stove when Elias stirred awake, his eyes opening to the faint orange glow and the steady sound of the wind pressing against the walls. For a brief moment, he thought he was alone again, the way most mornings had begun for years, but then he saw the figure still in the chair. Ayanna had not moved far during the night. Her head rested against the wood, chin tilted down, arms folded under the coat he had given her. She had not loosened her boots, nor had she let go of her guarded posture. Sleep had claimed her, but it had not softened her wariness. Elias sat up slowly, listening to the creak of the bed frame, making sure not to startle her. In his mind, a quiet weight turned over. She had trusted him enough to stay inside, but not enough to lay her body down where she might feel unprotected. He understood. Trust was not something freely given. It was tested and earned, and he had done nothing yet but keep her alive for one night. He rose, lit the lamp, and checked the door. The bar was still in place, the latch secure. Outside, dawn was only a pale line on the horizon. He poured water into a basin, the sound drawing her awake. Her eyes opened sharp, like an animal prepared to flee, but when she saw it was only him, her shoulders eased a fraction. "You slept," Elias said quietly. His voice was calm, even the tone of a man who did not want to force a reply. She straightened, pulling the coat tighter. "Not much," she answered after a pause. Her voice was low, roughened by fatigue, but steady enough. Elias nodded once, not pressing her further. He set a pot on the stove, spooned in coffee grounds, and waited. The silence between them was not empty but tense, full of questions neither of them had yet asked. He felt them building. Who was she running from? How long had she been out there? Why had she come this way? But he pushed them aside. Questions could wait. Food and warmth could not. He set bread to soften in broth again, this time adding a strip of dried venison. The smell began to fill the cabin, rich enough to remind them both that survival was more than just breathing. When he placed the bowl in front of her, she looked at it for a long moment before taking the spoon. She ate slowly, as though her stomach did not yet believe it would be fed. Elias watched her hands shake less with each bite. Only after she finished did she speak again. "Your name?" "Elias Carter," he said. "Yours?" "Ayanna." She gave nothing more at first, just that one word, her eyes watching his reaction. He inclined his head. It was not a name he had heard often, but it settled on the air with a weight that told him it mattered. He repeated it once under his breath, not questioning its meaning, only anchoring it in his mind. The morning stretched slow, marked by small choices that built the framework of how they would share space. Elias fetched water from the barrel and left the dipper where she could reach it. She washed her hands and face in the basin without asking. He set tools on the table to mend a leather strap, making his work visible so she could see what his hands were doing. She kept near the fire, her eyes often drifting to the window, as if expecting riders on the horizon. It was then that the unanswered questions from the night before began to press harder, not only for him, but for her as well. She asked suddenly, her voice sharp with the edge of fear, "Is anyone else here?" "No," Elias said, meeting her eyes. "Just me." "Do others come?" she pressed. "Not unless they want work or trouble," he answered. His voice was steady, but he felt the weight of her suspicion. She was measuring not just the truth of his words, but whether he would protect her if trouble came. Her shoulders loosened slightly, but the fear didn't vanish. It told Elias enough. She was not just running, she was hiding. He didn't press her for details. If she wanted to tell him, she would. For now, survival came first. Later that morning, when he stepped outside to tend the horse, he caught himself listening more carefully to the sounds of the land, the shuffle of branches, the creak of the fence. He knew the cabin was no longer only his refuge. By letting her in, he had changed its purpose. He felt the weight of that choice settling on his shoulders, but not with regret. It had been the right decision, even if it pulled him back into a world of danger he had sworn off. Inside, Ayana moved to the window, peering out with careful eyes. She traced the edges of the room as though trying to understand how it might serve as a defense if anyone came. Her mind, Elias knew, was still in survival. She did not relax. She did not trust, but she stayed. As noon drew closer, Elias finally broke the quiet. You'll need medicine for those bruises. The store in town has salve. 3 miles west. Her brow furrowed. Town. Yes, he said. Small. Sheriff keeps order, more or less. You won't have to speak to anyone if you don't want. She thought for a long time before nodding. Then tomorrow. Not today. Elias gave another small nod. He understood. One day at a time. That night, the fire burned steadier than the night before, and though Ayana still chose the chair by the hearth, her breathing eased sooner. Elias watched her eyes close, her hand falling away from the armrest. She still carried fear, but it was no longer the sharp, cutting fear of a hunted animal. It was the tired fear of someone beginning, against their will, to trust. Elias lay back on his bed, the rifle still within reach, his thoughts heavy but calm. He did not know what she carried in her past or what kind of men might follow her trail, but he knew this much. He had given her shelter once, and he would do it again if it came to that. Whatever her reason for being here, it had already become his reason too. The next morning began with a pale sky stretched thin across the desert, the kind of light that gave no warmth yet made every shadow sharp. Elias stepped outside first, pulling the door shut quietly behind him, and stood on the porch listening. The land was still. The only sound was the scrape of the horse shifting in the corral and the faint trickle of water moving through the creek bed half a mile away. He had learned long ago to read mornings carefully. A quiet morning meant the day could hold anything. When he returned inside, Ayana was awake, sitting on the edge of the chair with the coat draped over her shoulders. Her eyes moved around the cabin as if memorizing every board, every exit, every object that could be turned into a weapon or a shield. Elias noticed her boots were still on, the laces tightened. She had not slept in a way that allowed rest. She had slept in a way that allowed survival. He set a basin of water on the bench outside and left her to use it. When she stepped out a moment later, she flinched at the brightness, but she bent over the basin and washed her face and arms, the water turning brown as it dripped from her skin. Elias kept his distance, sitting on a stump near the corral and running a leather strap through his hands, fixing a buckle that had cracked. He worked with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted her to see his hands busy with something ordinary. As she dried her face with a strip of cloth, she looked around the clearing. For the first time, her eyes softened, not with trust, not yet, but with the recognition that this place was more than 4 walls. It had land around it, a corral, a tree line, and a man who kept it standing. It looked like a home, though the word might not have been one she was ready to use. Elias finally spoke. I'll need to go into town. There's salve there, better food than what I've got left. Ayana's brow tightened. Town? How far? 3 miles west. Not far, but folks talk. If you don't want to be seen, you can wait at the cottonwood outside the flats. She considered that, arms crossed tightly under the coat. Her instinct was to keep moving, never staying in one place long enough for someone to find her. But she had walked too far, lost too much strength. The thought of returning to the road alone made her stomach twist. I'll wait, she said finally, but only until the sun moves past that tree. She pointed toward the cottonwood, her voice steady but layered with caution. Elias gave a short nod. That's enough. Before they left, he gave her a small piece of jerky and filled a canteen for her. He did not ask if she had money, family, or anyone waiting for her. He could feel the questions on the edge of his tongue, but he swallowed them. Pushing would only close her off more. What mattered now was keeping her alive and keeping attention away from the cabin. They set out together. Elias led, his rifle strapped over his shoulder, his steps measured so she could follow without strain. Ayana walked behind, silent except for the crunch of her boots on dry earth. Her eyes swept the horizon constantly, not as a curious traveler, but as someone who expected danger to rise out of the ground itself. She carried herself as though one wrong sound would send her running again. When they reached the cottonwood, Elias stopped. He pointed to the shade under the wide branches. "Wait here. I won't be long." Ayana hesitated, studying the open land around them. She hated the thought of being left in the open, but the tree offered cover and water lay not far beyond. She pressed her back against the bark, keeping her view wide. "Go," she said, her voice clipped, but her hand gripped the canteen tight, betraying the weight of the choice she was making: to stay, to wait, to rely on someone else's return. Elias started toward town, each step pulling him closer to the noise and questions he had avoided for months. As he walked, his mind turned heavy. He thought of how quickly this had changed. One night of opening his door, and now his world was no longer just his own. He had chosen to bring her inside, and with that choice came responsibility. If men came looking for her, if her trail led enemies to his cabin, he would have to stand between them. He wondered why he had done it, why he hadn't sent her away. But when he pictured her bruised face and shaking hands at his door, he knew the answer. He had not been able to. Back at the cottonwood, Ayana leaned against the trunk, her eyes fixed on the horizon in the direction he had gone. She thought of running, of disappearing before he returned. It was what she had always done, but her body ached, and her stomach turned hollow, and her hands still trembled from nights spent without rest. More than that, something about the man unsettled her. He had not touched her, not asked her for anything, not pressed her for answers. He had only given her water, food, and silence. That was rare, dangerous in its own way. It made her wonder if maybe, just this once, she could stay put. As the sun climbed, the land brightened, the heat pressing down on the earth. Ayana stayed in the shade, watching for riders, every muscle taut. She didn't trust the quiet. She didn't trust that safety would last. But for the first time in months, she had chosen to wait, and that decision, small as it was, felt like the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. The town was little more than a row of false front buildings, dust rising off the wagon ruts that cut through its single street. Elias had not come here often since he'd taken to living apart, but every time he did, he felt the same weight settle on him. The weight of eyes measuring him, of memories tied to men who still remembered his younger years when he rode harder and fought more than was wise. He pushed that aside, stepping into the general store with his hat low. The clerk, a wiry man with spectacles, glanced up from his ledger. His eyes traveled over Elias's shirt, worn but clean, then down to the dust on his boots. "What'll it be?" the clerk asked, neutral but curious, as if already expecting Elias to say more than he would. "Salve," Elias said plainly. "Clean gauze, lard, a bar of lye soap, and flour. Coffee, too." His voice carried no invitation for questions, but he could feel the air in the store change. From the far end of the counter, a man in a gray vest leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Haven't seen you in some time, Carter," the man said. "Word is you keep yourself out by the flats. Folks say you've got company out there." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, waiting for a crack. Elias kept his gaze on the clerk as he counted out coins. "Fence repairs keep me busy. That's all." The man in the vest smiled, thin and deliberate. Funny, because riders spotted someone moving near the quarry a few days back. "Woman," they said. "Apache. Don't suppose you know anything about that." The clerk looked nervous now, glancing between them. Elias slid the last coin across the counter, collected his goods, and only then turned slightly toward the man. His eyes were calm but firm. "I keep to my land. Anyone else on it is my concern, not yours." For a long moment, the two men held each other's stare. The gray-vested man's smirk faltered just enough to reveal irritation. Then he leaned back again, as though the exchange had meant nothing. Just making conversation. Elias left the store without turning his back until the door was closed behind him. Outside, the street felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that meant words had been exchanged that would be carried further than the walls of that store. He tied his goods to the saddle and set out, his jaw tight. He knew what those questions meant. Someone had seen Ayanna, and someone wanted to know why she had come this way. When he reached the cottonwood, she was where he had left her, crouched low in the shade, scanning the horizon. Her eyes snapped to him the moment he came into view, her hand gripping the canteen as if it could be used as a weapon if needed. Only when she recognized him did she ease, though not fully. "They asked about you," Elias said once he was close enough. He didn't waste time softening the truth. "Men in town. Asked if I had company. Mentioned a woman seen near the quarry." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "They'll keep looking." "Who are they to you?" he asked. It was the first direct question he had put to her since she'd arrived. She hesitated, her eyes locked on the open land beyond the tree. "Men who think they own what they can take. Foremen. Traders. Outlaws who deal with both. I ran. That's enough for them to come." Elias considered this in silence, weighing it carefully. He had known trouble would come with her, but hearing it out loud set it into stone. Still, his decision had been made the night she appeared at his door. He wasn't about to turn her back to the men she was running from. "Then we stay ahead of them," he said, "and we don't give them reason to think this cabin is theirs to enter." Ayanna studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his calm was strength or foolishness. What unsettled her most was that she could not read him fully. Men she had known before always wanted something, always showed their demands quickly. This one offered nothing but silence and the steady presence of someone who had already made up his mind. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was dropping, throwing long shadows over the land. Ayanna sat by the hearth again while Elias unpacked the goods. She opened the tin of salve, dabbing it carefully onto the bruise on her cheek. He gave her space but watched from the table, making sure she could manage it herself. Later, as they ate, she broke the silence with a question that had lingered since the first night. "Why are you alone out here? Men don't build cabins just to be alone." Elias looked down at his bowl. He didn't answer right away. The truth was not a secret, but it wasn't something he spoke often. Finally, he said, "I lost a family once. Thought distance would keep me from losing anything again." Her eyes lingered on him, searching for more, but he left it there. He wasn't hiding the truth, only choosing how much of it to hand over. She seemed to understand. She didn't push, and he didn't add more. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Elias checked the door and laid the bar across it. Ayanna's eyes followed his movements, the way he moved with quiet certainty, each action deliberate. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean back into the chair, her body still tense but no longer ready to spring. That night, as the fire settled into embers, both of them carried unspoken thoughts. Elias knew the men in town would not let the matter rest. Ayanna knew she had pulled danger to his door, but neither of them moved apart. Whatever was coming, the cabin was no longer a place for one person alone. The night after Elias returned from town carried a different kind of silence. The fire burned steady, but the air inside the cabin was heavy with what he had told her, about the men asking questions, about how trouble had already brushed close to them. Ayanna sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around the coat he had given her, staring at the flames as though weighing whether she should stay or take to the road again. Elias sat at the table, mending the strap of his saddle, but his eyes drifted off into her face. He could see her mind working, the way her jaw tightened when the logs cracked, the way her gaze shifted to the door as if measuring how fast she could reach it if she had to. It was then that she asked, sharp but quiet, "Are we alone here?" The words came sudden, as if pulled from the fear she'd been holding back. Her voice wasn't just asking if others were outside. It was asking if this cabin was safe, if his silence meant he had hidden intentions. Elias looked up from his work. "Yes, just us." She searched his face, waiting for a flicker of doubt or a lie, but he gave her none. His answer was plain, uncolored by hesitation. Still, she pressed once more. "You wouldn't bring others here?" "No," he said. His tone carried weight, firm enough to make the point, but calm enough not to frighten. "No one else comes through that door unless you open it." Her shoulders dropped slightly, A release so small most men would have missed it. Elias didn't miss it. He knew the question had been less about the cabin and more about him. After a long pause, she stood. Her hands moved to the ties of her dress, pulling them loose with slow, deliberate motions. Elias felt his chest tighten. He thought at first she meant something he hadn't asked for, and part of him braced, not with desire but with concern, because if this was about debt or bargain, he wanted no part of it. But as she lowered the dust-stained dress and laid it across the chair, he saw the truth. This wasn't about seduction. The dress was ruined, stiff with dirt and blood, torn where it had caught on brush during her flight. She was shedding what had carried her suffering, letting it fall away because it no longer served her. Beneath, she wore a thin shift, plain and torn at the hem, her skin marked by bruises on her arms and ribs. She did not look at him as she reached for the basin, poured water, and began to wash. The soap lathered weakly, but enough to lift the grime from her face and neck. Steam curled upward in the lamplight. Her movements were slow, careful, as though every stroke of the rag was reclaiming something she had lost along the road. Elias turned his eyes to the fire, but he did not leave the room. He knew leaving might read as shame, and approaching might read as intrusion. So he stayed, steady, giving her space without abandoning her. His thoughts turned heavier as he listened to the quiet sound of water dripping back into the basin. He thought of his own past, how grief had stripped him down, how he too had once needed to shed the weight of what he carried. It stirred a feeling he had not wanted to revisit, but it also bound him to her in a way he hadn't expected. When she finished, she wrapped herself in the coat again, sitting close to the fire with wet hair clinging to her shoulders. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked less like someone on the edge of collapse and more like someone reclaiming control. Her eyes lifted, meeting his for only a moment. The look was brief, but it carried a truth Elias understood. She had chosen not to run tonight. He gave her no speech, no questions. He only nodded once and placed another log on the fire. The crack and flare of the flame filled the silence between them. That night, Ayanna lay down on the floor near the hearth instead of in the chair. Elias watched from his bed, the rifle still close, but his thoughts eased slightly. She had asked if they were alone. He had given her his word. Now she had tested it in her own way, and for tonight, she seemed willing to believe it. As sleep took hold, both carried unspoken thoughts. Elias wondered how long before the men in town returned with sharper questions. Ayanna wondered how long before her past would find her again. But in the small cabin, with the fire keeping the dark at bay, they both allowed themselves to rest. Not with certainty, but with the fragile trust that had begun to grow. The morning after Ayanna shed the ruined dress, the cabin felt changed. The air was still heavy with silence, but it wasn't the same silence of suspicion and distance. It was the silence of people who had acknowledged each other and were trying to understand what that meant. Elias rose early, pulling on his boots and stepping outside to tend the corral. The horse shifted, snorted, and Elias ran a hand along its neck, feeling the steady comfort of a familiar routine. He tightened the rails of the fence, his mind never far from the question of what came next. When he returned, Ayanna was awake, kneeling by the fire, stitching a tear in the shift she had worn beneath the coat. The salve had done its work overnight, softening the angry purple edges of her bruises. She worked with quiet focus, her hands steady, as though sewing a garment was an act of reclaiming normal life. Elias noticed this, but said nothing. He simply sat at the table, poured water into a cup, and let the day take shape around small movements instead of words. But both of them knew things could not stay simple. Questions lingered, both for them and for anyone watching from outside. Why had she been running? How far would the men searching for her go? What would Elias do when they came closer? These were thoughts neither of them voiced, but they were present in every look toward the door, every sound carried on the wind. By mid-morning, the first answer arrived. 3 riders approached slowly from the west, their figures small at first against the pale horizon, then sharp as they drew closer. Elias stepped onto the porch, standing tall but calm, his rifle leaning against the wall within reach. Ayanna moved to the window, her body tense, her eyes locked on the strangers. The men stopped short of the fence. One wore the same gray vest Elias had seen in town. He tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "Carter," he called out, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Heard you've got company out here." "Woman came this way, so folks say." Elias rested his hand on the porch post, his stance steady. "Fence line's clear. Nothing out here but me, a horse, and work to be done." The man in the vest smirked. "Funny, because I heard different. Said she was Apache. Said she might be hiding out." His eyes drifted past Elias, toward the dark square of the cabin door. Inside, Ayanna crouched low, her hand gripping the rifle Elias had left near the wall. She did not aim it, but she held it ready, her breath shallow. Her whole body was caught between fight and flight. She thought of running out the back and vanishing into the desert, but her legs wouldn't carry her. "Not now." Elias's voice cut through the moment. "You're standing on land that isn't yours. Unless you've got business written down by the sheriff, you don't cross that fence." The vest-wearing man tilted his head, studying Elias. For a few seconds, tension stretched across the yard like a pulled rope. The riders shifted in their saddles, uneasy. Then the man gave a thin smile. "Didn't mean to offend. We'll be seeing you, Carter." He turned his horse, and the others followed, slow and deliberate, as though leaving a warning behind. When the dust settled and the riders disappeared, Elias went back inside. Ayanna was still at the window, the rifle tight in her grip. Her knuckles were white, her breath fast. Elias spoke low and steady. "They'll come back. Next time, they'll bring questions for the law." She finally looked at him, her voice breaking through her fear. "They know I ran. They won't stop." Elias sat across from her, his expression serious, his words chosen with care. "Then we make sure they don't decide this cabin is theirs to walk into. Tomorrow, I'll take you to the sheriff. Better to be seen on our feet than dragged out of hiding." Ayanna studied him. Part of her wanted to protest, to say she had no trust left for men with badges. But another part of her knew he was right. If they showed themselves in daylight, as people with nothing to hide, the town might hesitate before siding with riders who came in the dark. That night, she set the rifle against the wall by her bed of blankets near the hearth. She did not ask if he would protect her. His actions had already answered. Instead, she asked a different question, her voice low but certain. "Why risk yourself for me?" Elias didn't look away. "Because the last time I turned my back on someone who needed me, it cost more than I could carry. I won't do it again." Ayanna said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him longer than before. The fear in her gaze didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, something quieter, heavier. For the first time since she had arrived, she believed he wasn't waiting for her to repay him. He was waiting for her to decide if she could stay. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of dust and mesquite. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, the shadows drawing close. Both of them knew the riders would return, but for tonight, neither moved apart. The fragile trust they had begun to build now had to stand against the weight of what was coming. The morning came with a sky washed pale by wind, the kind of light that made every building in town look worn and tired. Elias saddled his horse in silence while Ayanna pulled the coat around her shoulders. She hesitated before climbing up behind him, her hand gripping the back of the saddle tight. It was the first time she had allowed herself to ride with another since she had fled, and the unease in her body told Elias she had not forgotten how quickly trust could be broken. He said nothing, only steadied the horse and set them toward the settlement. The ride was quiet except for the hoofbeats, steady and deliberate. Ayanna's eyes scanned the horizon constantly. She expected the riders in the vest to appear, to block the road, to claim her, as if she were something that could be taken. When the town's false fronts appeared ahead, her shoulders stiffened. She had seen towns before, places where men spoke of law but sold people in the same breath. Elias felt the tension in her grip and leaned his voice back just enough for her to hear. "We'll go to the sheriff first. Nothing else." The sheriff's office was a plain wooden building with a door that creaked when Elias pushed it open. Inside, Sheriff Tomlin sat behind a desk littered with ledgers, his mustache trimmed, his eyes weary. He looked up at Elias first, then at the woman behind him. Surprise flickered in his gaze, but not judgment. Not yet. Elias removed his hat. There had been men riding my way. Gray vest, two others with him, asking about an Apache woman. They came to my fence yesterday. I told them to leave. They'll be back. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Elias carefully before shifting his gaze to Ayanna. And you? He asked. His tone was measured, not harsh. What's your part in this? Ayanna's eyes narrowed. She did not like being asked, did not like being pulled into a room where the weight of authority pressed against her. For a moment, she considered saying nothing, but then she drew a breath and spoke, each word clipped and direct. I left men south of the ridge. Foremen, traitors, outlaws. They wanted to keep me. I would not stay. They will not forgive that. The sheriff tapped a pencil against his ledger, his brow furrowing. He had heard stories like this before, stories that meant trouble if ignored. No law broken by running, he said finally, and no law gives those men claim over you. If they ride into this town again, I'll ask them their business in front of witnesses. They won't like that, but I'll do it. Elias gave a single nod. It was the answer he had hoped for, though he knew it wouldn't stop the men from trying again. The sheriff leaned forward. Carter, you should know, some folks don't care much about the line between law and profit. If they think she's worth something, they'll keep pressing. You're putting yourself in their path. I already am, Elias said simply. For a long moment, the sheriff held his gaze. Then he nodded once, pushing his chair back. So be it. I'll stand behind you when they come back. But understand, this town isn't a fort. We've only got as much law as the people here are willing to carry. As they left the office, Ayanna's expression was unreadable. On the street, she asked Elias quietly, "Why would your sheriff help? Men like that don't usually stand against others like him." Elias pulled his hat low against the wind. Because sometimes showing your face in daylight makes others think twice. Hiding only makes them hunt harder. She thought on that as they walked to the horse. For so long, her instinct had been to vanish, to keep moving until no one could follow. Now Elias was telling her the opposite, to be seen, to stand, to take up space as if she had a right to it. The idea unsettled her, but something in the sheriff's steady words and in Elias's calm made her wonder if it might be true. On the ride back, they passed a wagon headed toward town. A woman in the seat, with two children beside her, raised a hand in greeting. Ayanna stared, her throat tightening. The woman's look held no suspicion, only recognition of another traveler. It had been years since anyone looked at her without measuring her value in labor or trade. She turned her face away quickly, but Elias saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was lowering behind the ridge. Elias set the supplies inside, while Ayanna stepped to the small window. She placed a row of tiny shells on the sill, shells she had carried in a small bundle tied at her waist. Elias noticed, and though he didn't ask, she explained quietly, "One for each day I am free. Easier than marks on wood." Elias nodded once. He understood the need to count days when freedom felt uncertain. He had done the same in his own way after losing his family, measuring each day by chores and fences, marking survival through routine. Seeing her shells lined there gave him a new thought. Maybe survival wasn't only about solitude. That night, the firelight flickered across both their faces as they ate in silence. The questions from before still lingered. What would the riders try next? How long until they came again? But now there was something else. They had shown themselves in daylight. The sheriff had spoken in their favor. The town had seen them together. It wasn't victory, but it was a beginning, and both of them knew beginnings were rare things on the frontier. The first 2 nights after their visit to the sheriff passed with uneasy quiet. Elias and Ayanna settled into a rhythm, splitting wood, tending the horse, cooking simple meals, but beneath each task ran the same current of tension. They both knew the men in the vest would not let the matter rest. Ayanna slept near the fire, her shells lined neatly on the windowsill. Each one marking a day she remained free. Elias lay on the bed, his rifle within reach, his eyes drifting closed only when exhaustion finally pressed him down. On the 3rd night, the trouble they had been waiting for arrived. It was past midnight when the sound came. Hooves moving slow, circling. Ayana's eyes snapped open first. She sat up, listening hard, then moved to the window without making a sound. Elias was already awake, his hand on the rifle, his body still, every sense alert. Through the cracks in the shutter, they both saw the figures. For riders now. Not three, moving with the quiet purpose of men who didn't come to trade words. One of them dismounted, boots crunching on the dirt, and tried the door. The bar held, the frame groaning but refusing to give. Elias stood by the door, rifle angled low, his voice steady but cold. "You're not welcome here." From the other side, the man in the vest called out, his tone sharp now, stripped of the easy smirk he had worn in town. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, Carter. We'll take her, and no one in this county will fault you for handing her over." Ayana's stomach knotted at the sound of her old life reaching through the dark. Her grip tightened on the lamp she held, its light spilling across the room. Her fear was sharp, but not paralyzing. She raised the lamp high so the riders outside could see her face clearly through the window. "My name is Ayana," she said, her voice hard, "and I don't belong to any man." The words carried further than she intended, echoing in the stillness. For a moment, silence followed. Then the man in the vest spat back. Brave talk from behind a locked door. He shoved against the wood again, but the chain Elias had fixed held firm. Elias pulled the door open, just a crack, far enough for the barrel of his rifle to show, the chain still keeping it shut. His voice was low, steady. "Sheriff knows your faces. He told you to bring written business. You've got none. You try to force this door, you'll answer to me first and him after." For a long, tense moment, the riders weighed their odds. One shifted in his saddle, muttering under his breath. The man in the vest glared through the gap, his eyes catching the light of the lamp, then cursed and pulled back. "This isn't done," he growled. They mounted up, circling once before fading into the darkness. Elias shut the door, slid the bar back into place, and turned to find Ayana still standing with the lamp raised. Her hands were trembling, but her jaw was set. The fight she had carried in silence for months had found its voice. Elias stepped closer, lowering the lamp gently from her grip. "They'll be back," he said, his words more fact than warning. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode hard into town. Ayana stayed behind, watching the road from the porch, the rifle laid across her knees. Her stomach twisted with dread at being left, but she stayed rooted. For once, she didn't run. By noon, Elias returned with the sheriff and two deputies riding at his side. The sheriff carried a folded paper in his hand, authority enough to put words to the warning Elias had given in the night. By dusk, when the riders came again, they found more than a cabin alone. A line of townsmen stood at the fence, men who worked iron, sold goods, drove wagons. Ordinary men, but armed and willing. The sheriff read from his paper, clear and public, demanding the riders state their business or move on. The men in the vest offered no names, no claim, no proof. Their silence condemned them more than any accusation. The sheriff gave them a choice: leave or face the town as a whole. After a long pause, the riders turned their horses and left without firing a shot. That night, the cabin was quiet again, but the air inside was different. The fight was not over forever, but the balance had shifted. Ayana placed another shell on the sill, her hands steady now. She looked at Elias across the firelight and saw not just a man who had given her shelter, but one who had chosen to stand with her in the open when it mattered most. Elias didn't say much. He rarely did. But as he set his rifle down and closed the door for the night, he knew this truth. The danger wasn't gone, but she was no longer alone in facing it. And neither was he. The days that followed the standoff at the fence carried a weight of calm that neither Elias nor Ayana fully trusted at first. The riders had left under the sheriff's watch, but both of them knew men like that didn't vanish simply because a paper had been waved and words spoken in front of a crowd. Still, the quiet stretched on long enough for life at the cabin to settle into something more than waiting for trouble. Elias threw himself into work, patching rails along the corral, digging a shallow plot behind the cabin where the soil was dry but workable. Ayana knelt beside him, turning the dirt with her hands, setting small stones along the edge to hold the earth. It was simple, backbreaking work, but to her it meant more than food. It was proof she could still build, not just run. She had spent too long moving from place to place, her hands bound to labor that was never hers. Now, each seed she pressed into the soil felt like a claim on her own life. Inside the cabin, small changes grew noticeable. Ayanna began cooking with Elias instead of only accepting food from his hand. She taught him how she stitched 2 lines in a seam so the cloth wouldn't tear again, and he showed her how to set snares along the creek. They moved carefully, like 2 people circling a line neither dared cross too fast. Yet, the silence between them was no longer strained. It became a space filled with work, with shared glances, with a sense of belonging that neither of them had expected when she first stood bruised in his doorway. Unanswered questions hung over them still. What future could she claim in a land where her very presence stirred suspicion? How much of his past still weighed on him? Beyond the family he had admitted losing, Ayanna asked none of this directly, but sometimes her eyes lingered on him longer, as though she was measuring if she could trust him with the full truth of her past. Elias, for his part, felt the urge to ask her where she had come from, who exactly had tried to keep her, why she bore the scars she carried. But each time, he let the silence hold instead, believing answers would come when she was ready. The settlement made the first move. The clerk from the store came riding out one afternoon with a ledger, claiming the sheriff's deputies had tallied the time spent guarding the fence. Elias expected the bill to be more than he could pay, but before he could reach for his coins, Ayanna stepped forward. From a small bundle she carried since before the cabin, she drew out beadwork, a belt, bracelets, a pouch worked with careful patterns. The clerk's eyes widened. He knew their worth, not only in money but in demand. Within a week, Ayanna's beadwork began circulating in town, traded for flour, coffee, and credit in the ledger. People who once might have looked at her with suspicion began to speak of her craft. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. For Ayanna, it meant something she had not felt in years. Her hands, her work, could sustain her freedom. One clear afternoon, when the fence stood straight and the first sprouts of beans broke through the soil, Elias asked her a question that had been building in his chest. "Do you want this cabin to be only a refuge, or something more?" Ayanna looked at the shells on the windowsill, now lined in a careful row, each one a day survived. She touched one lightly before answering. "I want to choose the door I walk through each day. I want to leave if I must. I want to return if I choose. I will not be owned, not by men in vests, not by anyone." Elias nodded slowly. His eyes held hers, steady without demand. "Then let's make it that way. A place that's yours as much as mine. Sheriff can bring a man from the county seat. He'll stand witness if you want something binding." The offer hung between them, heavier than any silence they had shared. For Ayanna, it wasn't the promise itself, but the way he had framed it. Freedom first, then choice. No chains, no debt, only an agreement spoken plain. She considered the porch, the corral, the small window where her shells marked her days. At last, she said, "If the vows allow leaving and returning without debt, then yes, I will stay." Elias's shoulders eased for the first time in weeks. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes was clearer, lighter. That evening, as the fire burned and the wind pressed against the walls, Ayanna placed another shell on the sill. She didn't count aloud, but Elias knew what it meant. Another day lived free, and now, perhaps, the beginning of a life chosen instead of one endured. Sunday came with a hard blue sky, an air so still it seemed the land itself was waiting. Elias had risen early, brushing the horse down, his movements careful, as if each stroke of the brush steadied his mind. Ayanna sat on the porch, the coat across her lap, watching him. She had placed her shells in a small pouch that morning, tied neatly with sinew. For months they had been a tally of survival, but today she no longer needed to count. Today, she chose to stay. By mid-morning, the sheriff arrived with a county man in a plain collar and coat. Behind them came a few neighbors, the blacksmith, the clerk, a rancher's wife with 2 small boys, people curious, but respectful enough to stand back. Elias and Ayanna met them under the cottonwood near the cabin, the same tree where she had once waited for him to return from town. Now, the moment felt different. No longer flight, no longer fear. It was a choice made in daylight. The county man opened a small book with a cracked spine. His voice was plain, not ceremonial. He asked them each for their names, then asked what promises they wanted witnessed. Elias spoke first, his voice even, that this place is yours as much as mine, that leaving and returning is your right, that no debt stands between us. Ayanna's gaze was steady, her voice quiet but strong, that we stand together in work and in quiet, that no man owns me, but that I choose to stay. The county man nodded once, closed the book, and said, "So be it." The sheriff shook Elias's hand, then Ayanna's, his expression calm but approving. The blacksmith stepped forward, handing Elias a flat horseshoe he had hammered into shape the day before. "Luck," he said simply. The rancher's wife set a small basket of bread on the porch rail. No one asked questions. No one pressed for details. The vows were enough. When the people rode back toward town, Elias and Ayanna remained under the tree for a moment, the quiet heavy but not uncomfortable. Ayanna placed one last shell in the pouch and tied it closed. "No more counting," she said. Elias looked at her, and though his expression barely shifted, the tightness in his shoulders eased. The weeks that followed carried no more riders. The men in the vest did not return. Word of the sheriff's paper and the town's witness had spread enough to keep them from pressing further. Slowly, the land around the cabin became theirs not by possession, but by presence. Fences mended, crops tended, meals shared. One evening, months later, after a storm had rolled hard across the flats but left the cabin standing, Elias carried the old dress, torn, stiff, worn beyond repair, to the fire outside. He set it down, and Ayanna struck the match. They stood together as the cloth caught and burned, not as a symbol, not as a gesture to be explained, but because it was time to let go of what had carried too much pain. When the flames died, Ayanna pressed the wool coat he had once given her back into his hands. "Hang it by the door," she said, "for whoever needs it next." Elias hung it there just as she asked. That night, the window was left cracked open, the shells quiet in their pouch. The cabin was no longer a place of waiting or hiding. It was theirs built not on silence alone, but on trust, work, and the simple choice to remain. The story did not end with fear nor with flight. It ended with something rare on the frontier, two people who had once lost everything, now standing side by side, their lives no longer carried by chance but by choice. For the first time, both of them slept without watching the door, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together.